today, how has that China changed? Is it that same brash China, or are we now actually sharing a border with a global superpower, and we are probably Canada in the equation?
No, I think China is not a global superpower in a military sense or in a political sense. I mean, China doesn't determine what happens in the Middle East, doesn't determine what happens in Europe and so on.
In fact, doesn't determine what happens in Afghanistan either.
China is a regional power in political, military terms, and frankly, in terms of soft power, the only people in the world who think as highly of the Chinese as the Chinese are Pakistanis, according to Pew.
Right.
I think about 60% of Pakistanis think China is wonderful. Nowhere else in the world. So, but in economic terms, China is a global power, is a global superpower. And I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the equation is, you know, how do rich people react? It's difficult to say. I mean, there is the other argument that the rich man in the village never gets into a fight himself. He gets other people to fight for him. And what's the point of being rich if you... But what's happened to China now is they see the environment getting tougher. They see their own growth slowing. They have, as I said, legitimacy has moved from communism to getting rich, but now that the economy is slowing, to nationalism. So, and they are more and more convinced that their future depends on the rest of the world. So they will go out and shape that world, and they have the means. After 30 years of nearly 10% growth, being the second largest military spender in the world, they have the means to go out and influence it. They've started a military base in Djibouti, the Gwadar they have. They will, you know, the PLA navies are in the Indian Ocean, in the Western Pacific. South China Sea, many people now say, is now the South China Lake. So you need to actually expect them to go out much more and try and shape that environment in their favor, because their own future depends on it, and they're convinced of this, that they are not going back into their old little shell. And they keep saying they recognize they can't do export-led growth anymore, they need domestic-led growth, they need to encourage domestic consumption, and they'll tell you we've made a huge shift. But if you break down those figures, they've made the shift by changing the way they calculate the figures. Today they include government spending in consumption. And once you do that, of course, 70%, and that's the state-owned enterprises are huge in that economy. So you can say, oh, consumption, our economy is now 70% consumption-led. But it's still also primarily investment-led. And if you look at the figures for, you know, rates of return on capital and on investment, I mean, capital output ratios actually have got worse and worse and worse steadily in China. So you have this overcapacity problem because you've done it. You have debt of about 274% of GDP, which is very high. I mean, you're talking about $29 trillion worth of debt all told. You can offset that by saying there's $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, about $24 trillion of domestic savings of people in the banks. But, you know, that's still quite a shaky foundation. You have asset inflation, especially property. So when that starts happening, then you actually start getting nervous about what's happening outside. In 1 year, in 2016, they actually, almost $1 trillion left China. Some of it as investment abroad, and their reserves dropped from $4 trillion to $3 trillion. And they imposed capital controls. But they can do this both informally and formally. They can just tell everyone, don't you dare move your money.
Right.
And they stopped it, just like they did with the stock market, by telling them, whatever you do, you won't sell your shares.